This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states.
Well, today on the Delighted Customers podcast, I am so excited to have a special guest from the world of academia, Dan McCarthy. Dan is an associate professor of marketing at one of the best schools in the entire country, the University of Maryland, and the Robert H. Smith School of Business. I say that jokingly because that's where I went to school. I first heard about Dan through Dr. Peter Fader from the Wharton School, who was one of my earlier guests probably 2 years ago on the show. And the two of them partnered together in a business, Dan will tell you a little bit about in a minute, that they sold to Nike, and then now work in a business together called Theta. And the focus of the research and the work they do is around customer lifetime value and customer-based corporate valuations. And so we're going to dig into that a little bit more. I want to tell you a little bit more about Dan, who's come from Emory after teaching there for about 7 years. Now he's at one of the finest schools in the country I mentioned before, University of Maryland. Dan, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah, clearly no bias there, but I would agree.
All right, go Terps. Go Terps. Dan has been featured in media outlets like the Harvard Business Review, the Wall Street Journal, Fortune, The Economist, USA Today, Barron, CBS, CNBC, and so many more. He's won so many different awards, and I'm just honored to have him on the show. And as I mentioned before, he's a partner in Theta. So Dan, can you tell us a little bit about what Theta is and the primary focus of the business?
Yeah, Theta is a best-in-class customer lifetime value prediction and insight business. We have two kind of primary markets that we focus on. One are investors. We help them understand if they're looking to make a purchase of some direct-to-consumer business or really any business that has trackable customers over time. We can help them understand how good are the unit economics of that business. When they acquire customers, are they making money or are they losing money? And so they're really interested in kind of better understanding when we kind of go beneath the top level financials, what can we see about the ability of the business to continue to generate operating leverage, that they can become more profitable as they grow, and to understand the profitability of customers that they acquire. It's like a very key ingredient to that. So that's kind of market number one. And then market number two are the corporates. The VP of marketing, everyone who's in charge of managing those customer relationships over time. If you had a crystal ball that could tell you, this is how many purchases these customers will make, this is how much revenue we're going to get, this is all the profit, and oh, by the way, this is how much we spent to acquire each and every one of those customers, then you can compute something like a return on investment at the individual customer level, which is a really powerful thing to have. So yes, we kind of do all that sort of modeling on behalf of the companies that we work with.
And so for the audience's sake, I know some people listening may be familiar with customer lifetime value, or lifetime value of a customer. So there's different acronyms around. But I know when I had Fred Reichheld on the show, he talked about what he called as the traditional capitalist financial metrics, and boo-hoo, hiss on those, and that we should be using something like customer lifetime value. Would you agree, and if so, why?
I would agree and disagree, not to be the two-handed academic, I think ultimately the value of a company is the discounted sum of the future free cash flows. If your business is not generating free cash flow, it's not going to be a valuable business. And so, ultimately, if that's what you need to know is what are those free cash flows going to be into the future? I mean, I don't know what else you call that except top line financials. But what we would argue is that to be able to understand what those future free cash flows will be, you really need to understand this critical piece of it. But I would also hesitate to ignore the importance of like overhead expenses. If we're thinking about customer lifetime value or customer experience or any of the net promoter score, any of those measures, oftentimes they kind of ignore overhead expense. Now, they might evaluate some new opportunity and say, well, this is how much we would spend to improve, how customers feel about us. And then, you can kind of carry out that exercise. But, ultimately some businesses, to get the whole engine running, it's more expensive than other businesses. And so you really can't ignore the fixed costs, when you think about valuation. And so to that extent, I think there is this piece that is often ignored by, us kind of customer people. And so again, it's not to say that what we're doing is any less important. I think it probably is more important, but yeah, I wouldn't want to diminish the importance of that when we're thinking about how much is my business going to be worth.
Yeah. And both are important, but in different ways, and you need to know that customer lifetime value. I think one of the premises of customer lifetime value is that we understand that all customers aren't actually the same, and they shouldn't be treated the same. Can you say more about that and how CLV plays into that?
Yeah, whenever you look at every customer, often will have a different value. Some people buy a lot, some people buy a little, and so inevitably you're going to expect some sort of a spread. But I think the mental image that some people have of what the resulting distribution of customer values is something like a bell curve. That a lot of people are in the middle, yet some who are a bit worse, some who are a bit better, But what that distribution actually looks like is more like this. You have this humongous slug. It could be anywhere from 40 to 80% of all your customers that are worth very little, potentially nothing, potentially negative, actually, when you factor in CAC, customer acquisition cost. And then you have this really small slug of customers, typically it's 5% of the cohort, that's generating all the value of the cohort. And so it's this barbell. And as soon as you start, kind of embracing the fact that you don't have a normal distribution, instead you have this crazy barbell thing, then it kind of begs these questions well, why do I have all these terrible customers? How are they different from the best ones? And then even if we were to assume that we can't really do a whole lot to change the customers, hopefully we can, but even if we couldn't, there's probably ways that we can acquire more of our better customers and maybe de-emphasize the acquisition channels or the things that are bringing in the lower quality customers. So yes, I think when you talk about embracing differences in your customers and this thing, embracing heterogeneity, embracing the variation, I think that oftentimes is what's being referred to.
So if you have the knowledge of what those best customers, so to speak, the ones that bring you the most value, then let me just throw out a couple of the advantages and see if I'm on point, or you would add or delete some, but you have knowledge in which to resource allocate. You have knowledge into how to optimize your channels. You have knowledge on how to personalize and customize the experience, and a knowledge on how to develop retention strategies, where your primary focus is going to start with those customers that are contributing the most to your value. Did I hit that right, or would you add or change any of that?
Yeah, that's right. And so I think oftentimes when there's this area of voice of the customer. You want to know, what do they care about? Do they care about convenience? Do they care about price? Do they like the colors that we're using? And it's to say that that's not important, but oftentimes it is the customer. We just kind of take this survey, we do it on a whole bunch of people, and then whatever results that we get for all those people, we just kind of take this simple average of them and we say, well, that's what the customers want. And what we would argue is maybe we want to have a segmented version of that, where let's look at the results of that, but just among the top 5% customers. And then let's look at the results for the bottom 80%. And maybe what you'd find is that the people who are on the top, they have actually pretty different things that they care about, than the people at the bottom. It's not that we want to ignore the people at the, who have lower values. It's just that we may want to have a different approach for them, because the things that they care about are different. If it's going to be equally expensive to do something for the low value people versus the high value people, well, if I know that I'm going to get more of a bump in my revenue from the high value people, I probably want to prioritize the initiatives that kind of focus on the high value people.
Before we talk about some applications of this, and some immediately come to mind, I want to talk about when I first posted about the interview I did with Dr. Peter Fader from Wharton, your partner. I think it was called Don't Treat All Customers the Same, is what we titled the episode. And I got a lot of negative pushback from people, in particular in the CX space, saying, no, you should treat all customers the same as if they're number one. And they thought it was, sort of a non-democratic way to view your customers when you don't treat them all the same. Have you ever heard anything like that? And does it make sense? I mean, you explain the financial reasons why it shouldn't be that, but have you ever heard that before?
Well, I think there's a few sources of that feeling. One is fairness. We need to be fair. we talk about equality, and here we're not being equal.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that is one of the sources of it. I think there's another that feels like there's a lot of harm that can be done, And so we might want to prioritize some people. I think sometimes they think that we want to kick those other customers to the curb.
Mm-hmm.
Or fire them, and certainly I'm not sure that we would advocate for that in almost any setting. So actions have consequences, and if we were to really like completely ignore or even fire some customers, that will create negative word of mouth.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think that can be legitimate depending on how far you take it. But we would not probably advocate for taking it as far as some people might be assuming. But yeah, I think I come from a background in finance. I went to Wharton for undergrad and then again for the PhD. In undergrad, I was kind of a straight up Wall Street person. So I went to a hedge fund for 6 years after graduating there. And ultimately, companies have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. And if you're the CEO of a firm and you are taking actions that are not kind of mindful of shareholder value maximization, you can get fired. And so it really matters. The board is in place to kind of uphold that too. And so when you think about all that we're advocating for, it's really just advocating for being mindful of return on investment. And I might make some investments that pay off well and others that pay off very poorly. And so here we now have the ability to be a lot more granular at the customer level in how we make those investments. But ultimately, that's all we're trying to do, is we're trying to avoid spending money and not getting anything for it.
So in terms of the way leaders approach CLV, let's say they've done some analysis, either using your firm or another, their own internal resources, and they say, okay, we think we know who our best customers are. What are some mistakes or missteps that they make in their approach to it?
So kind of mistakes, and they have the philosophy, but the question is the execution.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch. One of the ones that gets very little love, but is so important, is how we actually do the cost accounting. It sounds so dull, but you can get such a different view of how valuable your customers are if you allocate the cost the wrong way versus the right way. So, for example, like it would be very bad to allocate a whole bunch of truly overhead expenses to the customer contribution margin. So all of the lawyers and the accountants and the CEO's salary and the headquarters and all that, those we would want to leave out, because when you're acquiring your next 1,000 customers, you're not going to have to buy a new headquarters. Mm-hmm. Those costs are going to stay the same. So if you kind of encumber the contribution margin with those expenses, you're going to end up with this pretty dim view of how much your customers are worth. Mm-hmm. And it makes a real difference, because what that would then imply is that your return on investment is pretty poor. Mm-hmm. So how much should we spend on customer acquisition? Well, I'm going to be real gun shy, because I'm seeing these ROIs that are like super duper small. Mm-hmm. And in fact, maybe I should have made those investments. And so that could, lead you to underinvest in the customers. But it's very easy to come up with the converse, that you overinvest because you have this overly optimistic view of the value of your customers. So it could be that you're focusing on revenue and you're not taking into account cost at all. If you look on Google and you say, what is the definition of customer lifetime value? I guarantee you'll find a whole bunch of definitions that are purely revenue based and don't take into account costs at all. So again, it's not every single one of the references, but it's surprisingly common. So accounting for those costs is tricky. And again, there's kind of the issue of how do we calculate customer acquisition cost? How much did we spend to acquire a customer? That's like a deceptively difficult question to answer. Mm-hmm. You could spend a whole semester teaching a course just on that. And then the slightly easier but still kind of tricky one is, what is my variable margin? I get this revenue from that next marginally acquired customer. What are all of the expenses that I'm going to have to pay to be able to bring that revenue in? And so cost of goods sold, labor, payment processing, probably some amount of customer support, expected returns, fulfillment expenses. But there are some expenses that will also kind of scale over longer horizons of time. And so again, it's not quite as trivial as it might seem. So that's one thing that can dramatically swing like the return profile that you think that you're getting relative to reality. Now Theta, so we'll spend a good amount of time on that with our clients to make sure that we're all thinking about costs the right way. The other thing that we'll often see is that if you have a not very good model of what customers will do in the future, you say, well, I found this thing online somewhere, off the shelf. This will probably do fine, right?
Hmm.
Well, you'd be surprised at how bad those can be, depending on the business. There's a lot of things that matter a lot to get the right prediction of what those customers will do. And it's especially hard for the customers that you acquired relatively recently, because most of these models, they'll kind of look at customers you acquired a bunch of years ago. And they'll say, well, now we've kind of observed their lifetime value. Because they've been around for a while, maybe most of the customers have churned. We kind of know what they were worth, but the customers you acquired 4 years ago could have a very different payoff profile than the customers that you're acquiring today. And so we want to account for all sorts of sources of variation. And so having the right model becomes incredibly important, and it can lead to differences of a factor of like 2 or 3 in terms of what you're going to get over the next 5 years from them.
So when I think about differentiating experiences for your best customers, what comes to mind, as we talked before about don't treat all customers the same, is I think of Disney has an express pass, and I'm going to get the name of it wrong. You've got your corporate suite at the ball game. You've got your premier lounge at LaGuardia from Delta. You've just go on and on. Am I thinking about that in the right terms?
Those are certainly good ways of making your customers sticky. Yeah, I've written some research about the impact of signing up for some of those subscriptions. And obviously, with Delta, it's not a subscription. It's really having kind of a tiered loyalty program that encourages people to deepen their relationship with you, so you can kind of get access to certain benefits. Some people, they like the status of being able to say, I'm platinum, I'm gold medallion. So whatever it might be, these programs can help encourage that sort of behavior from them. And so again, I'm a ROI guy, and so the question would be, I'm going to launch the loyalty program. I'm going to provide these goodies, whatever they might be. Maybe it's free delivery on the purchases. Maybe I'm going to charge them a subscription fee. But let's kind of take into account all that. Let's take into account how it changes customer retention, how many times they buy, bring all that together, and that tells us how much money did we make from the program. And again, if you're going to present something like this to the chief financial officer, that's going to probably be the argument that will convince them that this is worth doing. I think that if you purely focus on, well, it's going to make people happier, we're going to get a more engaged customer. Well, engagement in what way? Are they going to go to the website more? They might talk about us on social media, and maybe we'll get some social media hit, but is that going to lead to more purchases, more revenue?
Yeah.
Yes, I think, to be able to kind of translate things like that to net profitability, I think that it's incredibly important.
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm thinking about going back to that. I don't know if it's an upside down hockey stick, but whatever shape the dumbbell curve is of those simplest, he called it the 80-20 rule. I think about the bank where I worked, and we had retail, we had commercial, we had mortgage, wealth management. The majority of deposit accounts, checking accounts, were not profitable at all. Anyone who just has a checking account with a bank and doesn't fund it with lots of money, which you shouldn't probably do, should probably put enough in there to make it an operating account and invest the rest. But if you just have a low balance and you're keeping a checking account, you're actually costing the bank money. There is a hope that at some point you'll take out a loan of some kind or get engaged in start a business, engage in more profitable businesses, and some of the customers do. But it's a great illustration of how you might not think about it from the outside, but you as a customer, you may actually be costing the organization money. Have you found that to be true?
Yeah, I think in a lot of businesses, most of the customers will be unprofitable for some reason or the other. Now, I'd say the other aspect, though, of lifetime value is that we do want to account for our best expectation of how customers will evolve over their life cycle. And so it could be that the checking account is kind of the gateway drug into the broader portfolio of services. Some people, they just kind of leave it at that and they say, don't worry, it's going to be fine,
Yeah.
these are kids, they're going to have families, they're going to get that car, whatever. But I would say let's quantify that. That's an empirical question. Like, let's take all the people, they first signed up with a checking account. Now let's just track them over time and see what proportion of them migrated into other services, how many people stayed checking account only. And that's, again, what gets us the value of the cohort is to be able to do that. And so, analogy to that would be in the mobile gaming sector. You have a lot of free-to-play games, and so inevitably you'll have a lot of people that stay with the free stuff. They never spend any money in the game, but they might be playing a lot. But for every 100 people, you'll have one person who does graduate, and they might spend like crazy on the game. So it could be a very valuable customer acquisition vehicle. But again, you want to be pretty numbers-minded about it. It doesn't mean that because they could, they will. And even if they do, there's the question of, well, what proportion of them do? And are there ways that we can be able to kind of nudge more of those people and kind of hit that sweet spot where we're bringing in a lot of people, but then we're getting enough of them to migrate that this pays the bills. So so again, it's not an insurmountable problem, but it does speak to the importance of that lifetime view.
What advice would you give to C-suite leaders who maybe haven't done a CLV analysis of their organization?
Get started with something easy. I think jumping straight into the modeling is probably running before you can walk. I advocate for kind of understanding the philosophy behind this, of not even looking at any data yet, understand what is the opportunity here. And then I think the second step is something like what Pete advocates for with the customer-based audit, where there's no models, it's still purely backwards looking, but it really helps you understand like how your business sits. Now, this is what the business looks like from the customer perspective, how much spread there is across the customers, how things are different by business unit, how things have been changing across the cohorts, all very valuable. And the nice thing about those views is that they don't require a prediction. There's just a lot of work that can go into having good predictions. And if you're going to present something to your boss or to the CEO of the company, and you have this heroic, 8-year forecasting horizon or something like that, inevitably the questions become, well, do I trust that? But here it's like auditable. You say, well, these are the numbers. And so as long as there's no quirk in your data set, you can take those as ground truth. And I think that can be a lot more compelling. You can get a lot of the other people in the company on board.
I remember when I worked at the bank in the Mid-Atlantic, I know that there were a number of initiatives, from studying whether or not to create a digital new account opening platform to buying a new interface for the many different software applications that drove the bank. And the big hurdle that I think came up quite often was, well, we got to get our hands around our own data before we can go get help. Have you heard that one before, and what would you say to that?
Yeah, if your data house is not in order, that can be a real issue. I would say our models, the data requirements are not so high. So I think some people use that as an excuse to never even look. Because they just have other things that are higher up on the pile, and they say, I just need some plausible reason to not do this now. But most of our models, they only require, at the base level, like a good transaction log. And you think, how many companies have that? Well, most of them should. Like, if their transaction log is really that bad, they might have like finance issues. Like, how can they do their accounting? I think usually when you start running into issues is like with everything else. The metadata about the customers, it can be so different. That it's great to have all the rest of it, but at least if you want to understand, like, this is how healthy my business is, this is the spread across the customers, usually you can kind of go to the transaction log and it should be pretty good.
Yeah. When you think about the payoff, pardon the pun here, of doing the work to get to things like CLV and getting your arms around it, my gosh, I mean, you just described, and we just talked about how you could be missing something really important, really big in focusing on treating everybody the same when, you're losing money on a good chunk of your customer base and you're making a ton of money on 5% or 10% and you're really not focusing on them. Dan, I want to ask you if you could share a success story. When you think about when you looked under the cover, when you've opened the hood and you think about something that you discovered with a client of yours that was sort of like what you would consider a success story from your standpoint?
I think one interesting one was Warby Parker.
Oh, yeah.
So this was a public company. We did this analysis using just the public data. And so those are kind of nice because you can say the name.
Yeah, right.
And if they're public, you have all of the income statement, the balance sheet, so there's a lot of data that is available. Now, you don't have the really granular data, so oftentimes you can't go to the segment level. And sometimes you can't go to the cohort level either. You can really just kind of get the overall view of economics. But
Dan, can I just interrupt for just a second? So for those listening who, when you're saying cohort, I think I know what you mean. I want to make sure that everybody's following along. So it's really a group of customers that you're looking at, and it's the same group you're going to look at over time. It's the same specific group of customers. Is that right?
That's right. It's a good point. So usually when I talk about a cohort, it's usually an acquisition cohort. So there's all sorts of different typically a cohort would be some sort of customer segment. And we define those segments by when were you acquired, where the definition of a customer acquisition is that they made their first purchase. They finally took the jump.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we'll often do our analysis in this cohort by cohort way. Yes, we'll say, what's the value of the customers that were acquired in Q1 2017, Q2 2017, so on and so forth. Let's kind of look at them over time.
So Warby Parker.
Yeah, so Warby Parker, unprofitable. At that time, they weren't even growing very quickly because this was post-COVID, and they were growing quickly before COVID. But they had like 2/3 of their revenue coming from stores, and all those stores got shut down. So, yeah, so they were, it wasn't their fault, but that was a headwind at the time that they were filing to go public, and they put a lot of great data in their filing, and they kind of had the usual canonical issue of they didn't even have a whole lot of revenue growth, not profitable. How do we value this company? Will they be a valuable business? Can they grow their way out of unprofitability? And again, that's the big thing that a CLV analysis can help you uncover. And we kind of looked at the numbers very carefully. We found a few errors in their filing that they had to restate along the way. And kind of that notwithstanding, we found that they actually were turning a pretty good profit on the customers that they were acquiring. And so that was certainly, it was heartening. We weren't able to get all the way up to the valuation that they were trading at right after they went public. No matter how we kind of dialed up the assumptions, we were getting like less than half of their valuation at that time. So we were kind of torn because we thought we would give them a clean bill of health from a customer perspective, but that doesn't justify any valuation. And the valuation they were trading at was just a bit too high from our perspective. So, lo and behold, what ends up happening, they ended up trading down to our valuation. They actually traded down to half of our valuation. And then we said, whoa, all right, now it's kind of the pendulum swung too far in the other direction. So we went back in, took a look again, because no valuation that you make is going to be permanent into the future. If we say, well, right now, based on what we see, the valuation is going to be 20. That doesn't mean that they should always trade at 20 for the rest of eternity. So, yes, we kind of went in when they were at like 10. And we said, well, actually, still getting around 20. So we put out the second piece that said, they're trading at 10, we think they're worth 20. And they actually ended up trading back not only to 20, but above 20. Actually, I haven't checked where they are today. But it's kind of this nice story from that perspective that we weren't just like a perma bear. We started bearish and then we actually moved to bullish, and now we're kind of somewhere in the middle. But the other nice thing about that story, which is a kind of a validation of this way of looking at the world, is they've continued to grow. If their CLV is positive and they continue to acquire enough customers, that means that they should become profitable. And in recent quarters, they've become profitable. So we feel like, well, that's also something of a validation that we were able to kind of uncover. They were able to grow their way into profitability. Whereas for some other companies that we've done analysis on, that has not been the case. Just the CLV to CAC is very marginal at best. And if it is, then you can grow a whole lot, acquire a whole bunch of new customers, but you're no closer to actually being profitable.
So you help Warby Parker see more clearly. It's a bit of a corny joke.
Yeah.
In the eyeglass world.
Customer value lenses.
Right. Yeah, and
really was their investors. I think that, I don't know what it's funny that their founders came out of Wharton too. So I'm from Wharton, Pete Fader, Wharton marketing professor. They were in his office. So we had, pretty close indirect ties with with the management there, but we had never spoken with them, and so I have no idea how they ever felt about it. But I will say, market investors have a way of always thinking that the current price is the right price, and so I still remember all of the flack that we got, when we were coming in so low, and you're being so stupid, you're not accounting for this, that, or the other thing. It's like, well, time will tell.
Yeah. Dan, I appreciate you keeping it simple enough for even me to understand. Thank you for what's behind the curtain, I'm sure, are complex algorithms and lots of data and AI and all that good stuff. And thanks to you guys, we don't need to know all that.
Well, I'd say I wish I was smarter, but this is kind of how I'm able to process everything.
Yeah.
I think there are some things that are truly complex. Most things are not as complex as they seem. Like if you get to really understand it, it actually is kind of simple. But I think, oftentimes it can be kind of hard to get to the point that you've kind of reached the appropriate level of simplicity and you haven't gone too far. But I think that customer lifetime value, in some sense, it's like so simple. I mean, you acquire customers, there's a price that you pay, there's what you get on the other side, and you kind of compare the two, and am I making money or losing money? And I want to make more money.
Right.
So, the models can get a little more complicated than that, but philosophically, it's really a pretty straightforward exercise.
It is. It is. What a wonderful discussion. I so appreciate having you on the show. But I want to ask you one last question, and that is, what delights you as a customer?
What delights me as a customer? Well, I'll give kind of one example just from yesterday. I was just saying how I took this trip to Boston, and all the flights were delayed in the airport on the way back because of the storm that came up the East Coast. And so my flight, it was scheduled to leave at 5:45. Now it's 9 o'clock. Now it's 10 o'clock. Now it's 11 o'clock. Still waiting. But the Delta Sky Lounge, again, going back to the Delta example, I'm one of those platinum medallion people. And to be able to just chill out in the lounge for hours, that was such a plus. And there's one thing to kind of get value like on an everyday basis, but there's another thing when crazy things happen that you could be in a real pickle, you could be much more uncomfortable, but they're able to kind of come through with services at that moment, at those times. And I feel like, here I place a lot of value on Delta for that obviously the flights tend to leave more on time. You're not going to have the issues of getting punched in the face or anything like that. But if you kind of end up in a pickle like this, to be able to have those services that are kind of readily available to you, they really come in handy. So yes, I'm a very happy Delta customer, even though I no longer live near the Delta hub anymore.
Right.
They'll make it much more okay than it could have otherwise been. And so, I think that can be underappreciated because those events kind of by construction don't happen very frequently.
Right. Well, Dan, I thank you so much for being on the show. If somebody wanted to get a hold of you, want to engage with Theta to do some work with you guys, what would be the best way?
Connect with me. I'd say LinkedIn is my main platform. I'm talking about this sort of stuff a lot over social media. So Daniel McCarthy, University of Maryland. You probably need the qualifier because of all the other Dan McCarthys out there. And we'd love to speak with you. I think our goal is to make CLV and CVCV boring. It's what everyone does, Like how could you not do it? So I think we're well on our way, but we still have a lot of work to do.
Excellent. Dan McCarthy, thanks so much for being a guest on the Delighted Customers podcast.
Thank you.